Well, I saw by the schedule that what I'm down for is to talk about my Amazon experiences, of which there have been many. I thought, if there's zest for it, I can go into the more woo-woo kind of stuff eventually. But given the focus of the group, I thought I would sort of review an ethnobotanical quest that's been a part of my life for a number of years. I'm amazed how many years when I now look back on it, because by telling the story of that quest, many of the issues of ethnobotany probably will emerge just in the course of it. As many of you who've paid attention to my stuff know, I'm very keen on DMT. Oh, and then let me talk then for a moment about why this is pharmacologically interesting and poses certain unsolved problems. Jonathan and I think other people have alluded to the fact that DMT is not orally active. Up to a gram has been taken orally and nothing happens. It's destroyed in the gut by monoamine oxidase. And the strategy for activating DMT, for instance, in ayahuasca, is that you must take it with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Then it can survive the enzymatic environment of the gut, pass into the bloodstream, hence to the brain, and an experience ensues. So it was thought, how can this DMT be orally active? It violates all the canons of pharmacology. And then people focused on the dust, the ash in which the thing was rolled, and everyone said, well, then it must be that it's being combined physically with an MAO inhibitor of some sort. And so we thought that, in the process of assuaging our freaky curiosity, we could also do good field work in ethnopharmacology by identifying, making vouchers, and bringing back samples of the monoamine oxidase inhibiting plants that we felt must be part of this. Well, the Witoto have a cultural history that it's necessary to explain a little bit about in order to see what the problems of doing field work with these people were. The 20th century is so crowded with horror, Auschwitz, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Somalia, the Chorrera rebellion in Namibia in the 1920s, genocide from hell to breakfast, that most people have forgotten an episode of 20th century history called the Putumayo rubber boom. This was a situation that arose from about 1912 to 1917 under the pressure of World War I and the perceived need to maintain a source of rubber. This was before the invention of synthetic rubber. British banking interests colluded with what were essentially mafias in the Amazon, a family called the House of Arana, to force these Witoto people to collect wild rubber. And it was as horrific as anything that went on at Auschwitz or anywhere else. People were told, they were given quotas of wild rubber, and if you didn't bring in your quota, people had their feet, the bottoms of their feet removed by machetes, children were impaled, and just on and on, a catalog of horrors. I don't want to bring you down. If you want to be a scholar of this stuff, read Hardenberg's book, The Putumayo, The Devil's Paradise. But the Witoto people took the brunt of this, and they went from a population of 50,000 in 1913 to 5,000 by the time we arrived on the scene in early 1971. Their natural home is at the headwaters of two rivers, the Igaraparana and the Caraparaná. Both rivers flow into the flow into the Putumayo. On the border, the Putumayo is the river which defines the border between Ecuador and Colombia, and then on its lower reaches between Peru and Colombia. And so the natural home of these Indians is at the headwaters of these rivers. In 1948, when a war was fought over these boundaries, that part of the Amazon was ceded to Colombia, and many of these Witoto people undertook a kind of a migration, much like, the Mormon population movement, or there have been many politically driven migrations in the 20th century, and they moved across the Putumayo River and established themselves on the headwaters of the Rio Ampiacu-Yaguasiasu drainage, which are small rivers which come out on the Amazon at Pebas in Peru. But we wanted to go to the original home of the Witoto, and this was a place called La Chorrera, and a unique geological feature in that part of the Amazon. In that part of the Amazon, it's very flat. The soil is this podzolic sand, and but at La Chorrera, it's the site of some ancient geological catastrophe of some sort. It's, I waver between thinking that it's an asteroid impact point or a volcanic eruption of some sort. An immense amount of basaltic rock has been brought up from great depth. The whole earth has been peeled back and laid on one side of this river, and the Rio Igaraparana flows there through a narrow gap and forms what's called a chorro. A chorro is not exactly a waterfall. It's not that steep. The word in Spanish sort of is evocative of a chute or a flume. The way it was explained to me is it's like a stream of piss. It's at that angle, a 45-degree angle, but very rapid. And the river, which has been moving very sinuously and slowly, acquires tremendous energy there and just comes pounding through this thing. It's quite spectacular and is a sacred site for the tribes all in that area. So, armed with Schulte's paper, we went to La Chorrera in early 1971. And the first thing that happened was we encountered a Colombian anthropologist who was set up on the Caraparaná, one river over from the Igaraparana, a fellow named Horacio Calle. Some of you may know him. Marxist, misogynist, screwball. And he assured us that we would never get this stuff. He said, these people have gone through hell at the hands of white people, and they have no reason to cooperate with you, and you should just leave the Amazon while, as he put it, there yet is time. However, we, put that aside, went on to La Chorrera, had a number of wild adventures not at all related to this quest, but eventually we stayed there 5 weeks, and we could not get them to cough up this ukuhe. I'm not sure if I said that's what the Witoto call this stuff, ukuhe. What complicated our quest was the fact that just a month before we got there, there were two shaman brothers, and they got into some kind of a hassle with another shaman, and this shaman smeared Varroa resin on the top rung of a ladder, and they were repairing this enormous maloka, which is what the Witoto call they build a communal building because they love to dance. And so they build these very high-ceiling communal buildings. I mean, they're like cathedrals. It's a very impressive thing to see. These two shaman brothers were repairing a break in the thatch of the maloka, and when one of them grabbed the top rung of this ladder with his sweaty hands, either, it wasn't clear, either because his hands were sweaty, he slipped, or he actually became intoxicated from the Varroa resin through absorption and he fell. In any case, he was killed. The surviving brother then did a magic on the shaman who he knew from taking ayahuasca was responsible for this murder, and caused this shaman's wife, daughter, and mother to be swept over the Chorro one day when they were very routinely crossing the Igaraparana above this waterfall. It was something that the Witoto did all the time. But when these people got out in the middle of the river, they couldn't escape a force, something under the water that just seized the boat and took it through the Chorro, and none of them lived through it. Then 2 weeks later, we show up asking questions. So it was, finished. Bad timing. We had a number of adventures not related to this, which are told in a book I wrote called True Hallucinations that will be published in April. And then we went back to Berkeley. But I was not satisfied. And passing through Colombia, I had bought emeralds on the way out of the country. I turned the emeralds at Harry Winston's in New York and took the money and went back to Colombia to have a second go at it. So then it took me a long time to get back to La Chorrera because we had been 5 on the first expedition. On the second expedition, it was just myself and the woman I was living with at that time. And we had many, many difficulties reaching La Chorrera. It took us almost 2.5 months. We waited 5 weeks for a boat at a place called Arica on the Putumayo, which is hell on earth. When Alfred Russel Wallace was there in the 1800s, he described the black fly as being so dense that it would sometimes blot out the sun. And it was true. It was absolutely hell. And the only way you could escape the black fly was to stay in metal buildings that the Colombian government had put up that reached about 115 in the daytime. And you were so damn glad to be cooking inside these things because the black fly was outrageous. We could only take baths between 3:30 and 4:15 in the morning. I'm not kidding. And we would go down this bank, this mud bank, to this sort of raft that was tied against the shore where the women washed the clothes. And if you lingered down there and were 5 minutes late climbing back up the hill, they're called moscos. Do you know what I'm talking about? They raise a little red dot on you when they bite you. And there are tens of millions of them. I mean, you really go nuts from this stuff. Finally, after weeks of being in this place, a Colombian naval vessel came and was on its way to La Chorrera. So we made a deal with the captain. It was 120 miles up this river to La Chorrera. You see, the first time we had been there, we had walked in from the Caraparaná on a trocha, a trail that took about 4 days. But because we had gear but not enough people, we had to do it this way the second time. So we went with the Colombian Navy. We got within a day of La Chorrera, and the engine blew out on this Navy vessel, and we drifted 14 days back to Arica. I thought that nothing on God's earth could be worse than returning to Arica, until I realized as we approached Arica that the river was flowing with such speed that when we actually hit the main flow of the Putumayo, there was considerable danger that we wouldn't be able to get the boat stopped at Arica, and that we would go out into the main flow of the Putumayo, and we would just be headed for Manaus, basically. And these guys were running along the bank, screaming, and people were throwing ropes, and guys would grab onto the rope and then be jerked off their feet into the river, and this whole thing. Finally, a few kilometers below Arica, they got it stopped, and we bailed, went back to Arica, stayed 3 more weeks for the next boat, and then we finally made it to La Chorrera and settled in. This was the 1st of July by now, and it took us till the 15th of November to get cooperation. There's a village in the primary from this mission at La Chorrera called Jarocamena. It's the site of one of the most horrific of these rubber boom massacres. And one day I was collecting butterflies in the forest. These people didn't speak any Spanish, none. I hardly did either, so it was a moot point. But one day I was in the forest, and I encountered, it appeared to me to be a chance encounter. Now I realize I was probably set up. This guy, this Witoto man, collecting plants. And I knew how to ask in Witoto, what is your name? I had about a 30-word Witoto vocabulary. So I asked this guy what was his name, and he answered Demetrius. And I digested this, and the letters D-M-T stood out very prominently in his name. So I just figured, look, I can't befriend these people or cure them or get tight with the chief. I just have to wing it. So I sat down with this guy and I said, we are looking for Ukuhe. And he was like, what? And I said, Ukuhe. And he said something like, Agahe? And I said, no, Ukuhe. It was clear he couldn't believe his ears that I would know this thing, which was secret, and you had to be initiated, and this and that. Finally, he got it, that I really was talking about what he thought I was talking about, and he said, and he indicated that he would cooperate. And I just figured, an encounter in the forest, who knows? And 3 weeks later, he showed up with his sobrino, his nephew, who spoke a tiny, tiny bit of Spanish, and had this story to tell about how it had been very hard to find the tree. They had been days and days in the jungle. He had given himself up for dead, but they had found it, they had made it, and here it was, and would I please give them 16 shotgun shells, which I had. This is a wonderful trade item in the Amazon. I mean, nothing pleases them like 16-gauge cartuchos. So we made this exchange, and he gave me these packets wrapped up in leaf that when I opened them up, it looked like chocolate, and it looked like sort of melting chocolate, this gooey brown stuff. And when I tasted it, having experienced ayahuasca, I expected that it would be bitter and astringent. And to my amazement, it was this totally unexpected taste. It was chalky, and it was sort of like kaopectate, if you know what that is. It was this strange chocolate mouth-coating stuff. So then we took it back, this woman and I, to our camp, and did what all good ethnobotanists do in this situation. We conducted a bioassay that night, and in Schulte's paper they had actually said how much, but I wasn't sure whether it had been rolled in the dirt. It wasn't in the dust. It wasn't little pills. It was this, like a brownie. Each one was like a melting brownie wrapped in a banana leaf. So I took 2, and, I was just braced for all hell to break loose. In fact, I had this woman tie me into my hammock so that I couldn't escape. You laugh. Nothing happened. Well, so then there was a real dilemma. There wasn't that much. And I figured, well, we've just been taken for a ride. They're getting their revenge for the rubber boom, and the Anglo has been, it's a problem. So I was very conflicted about whether to eat all of the rest of it and conduct a second bioassay, or to save it for laboratory analysis. And so what I did instead of either course was I took half of a dose and I spread it out on a banana leaf and I put it in the sun and I dried it to a powder, and then I made a pipe and I smoked it, figuring I will at least confirm whether it's tryptamine or not. And I felt then that it was weakly effective, but I wasn't sure, and we had no more, and by that time we were just at the end of our rope. I mean, we had been 5.5 months at this place, and the priest was putting pressure on us. There were a lot of problems. I don't need to go into it, but anyway, so we left the Amazon, and I forwarded the sample to the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm at Schulte's suggestion, and it was analyzed, and it came back. It did have DMT in it. And so I realized, Demetrius had been as good as his word, and but it was like sort of this weird, inconclusive thing, because we had never met the little man. We hadn't found our way into the flash. And so 8 years passed. And then and there was another trip to the Amazon in there, but it was not a trip for Ukuhe. It was a different trip to a different part of the Amazon. But then in 1980, Dennis and I, my brother Dennis and I and Wade Davis had an opportunity to ship out, and I don't want to say too much about this, but with a very weird cultish operation, the same people who run the biosphere in Oracle, Arizona. They had what they called an oceanographic research vessel called the Heraclitus. And early in 1980, botany departments all over the world got this strange letter on this stationery, which was the Institut Ecotechnique of...
Same letter, right?
Yes. from somewhere in France, and it said, "Dear colleague, we will be maintaining on station in the Amazon for the next 18 months, the research vessel Heraclitus. If you or your graduate students are doing work in the Amazon, we would be pleased to facilitate your work in any way possible," blah, blah. And Dennis was at that moment about to get his PhD, and Wade was in the same circumstance. He was at Harvard. Dennis was at University of British Columbia. So we thought, great, amazing, fortuitous. We'll go down. We had visions of drinking aperitifs at evening in our pressed whites with our French colleagues on the gleaming white decks of their super modern research vessel. Of Don Fidel's ayahuasca songs. So when we all assembled in Iquitos, here's a 90-foot-long, concrete-hulled Chinese junk. Just like a thing out of a hallucination. And we go aboard this thing, and it was within an hour, it was clear that we had some kind of really weird situation on our hands, because they knew nothing about science or ethnobotany, and they had no equipment. And when I pointed this out to them, they said, well, we practice an advanced philosophy that involves learning by doing. And, oh. So, okay. And they said, what can we do for you? They said, we believe in service. I was slowly putting it together that this was some kind of Gurdjieffian thing. They said, we believe in service. And what do you need? And they always referred to us as the scientists. They said, we want to be of service to you scientists. Well, Dennis, Wade, and I, we had hair and beards down to our ass. Wade had brought some girl with him named Etta Pye Turner. And we were pretty, And so we said, okay, well, here's what we need. We want an outboard motorboat. We want 3 55-gallon drums of gasoline. We want radios. We want 2 of your crew members, and we'll work on this ethnobotanical problem. And the plan was, this time, not the Upper Putumayo, because I had pretty much, it was. By this time, there was so much coke happening in Colombia, and the whole attitude toward ethnobotany in Colombia had gone to hell. So we decided that we would work the upper Yaguas-Yasu-Ampeyacu drainage, which was in Peru, where these displaced Witoto communities were from the 40s. So we, I'll shorten the story and dump out some of the more colorful details, but we slowly made our way up this river, truly a motley crew. And we were making general collections of all sorts, but what we discovered, well, first of all, the Varrolas are hellishly difficult to taxonomically define. Rosia referred to this yesterday and said they were waiting for a specimen to flower before they would determine it. Actually, unless it's an easy one, this won't help. The definitive monograph on the Varrolas, the taxonomic distinctions are made by looking at these structures on the underside of the leaf called trichomes. They're essentially hairs which split either in 2 or 3 or 4, and you have to have a microscope, and then this tells you what the species is. So what we found was we would go into these villages and there was more Spanish in this situation, so we could work through that. And these people, they didn't know what we were talking about. Or we would find shaman, and we would, they would say, is it ayahuasca you want? We said, no, it's Ukuhe. And people would say, well, when I was a child, I saw my grandfather prepare this, and I've never made it, and I've never taken it, but I think I can get it together for you. And so, and we found, there was a spectrum of this kind of thing. Nobody said, oh yeah, got it, I know what you're talking about. We collected 4 samples in the course of 6 weeks of field work up this river from 4 different shaman. And at a place called Brio Nuevo on the headwaters of the Yaguas Yasu, he brought us enough that we could do more than simply pickle it for later analysis. So we drew straws for the bioassay. And it's not clear whether Dennis won or lost, but anyway, it came to be his fate to test this stuff. So we gave it to him, roped him into his hammock, and he had a hell of a time. He said, it's cardioactive. He thought he was having a coronary thrombosis, basically. I mean, it just pounded, and I put my hand on his heart, and I could feel, it felt to me like his heart was going to break through his chest cavity. I mean, it was horrible. And the next morning, we went to this guy, Octavio, and said, so what's the story? This is pretty stiff. He said, yeah, it takes getting used to, doesn't it? Well, so then Dennis and Wade published on this. We did analysis, and what we came to feel about this was that these Varolas are genetically just a mess. That's why it's so hard to distinguish this stuff. And chemically, it's too complex. When you look at the HPLC data on these extracts, there is not only DMT, but there's a whole spectrum of tryptamines, psychoactive, inactive, cardioactive, just a smorgasbord of this stuff. And I think that what we were dealing with actually was a hallucinogen that slipped out of our reach, that the knowledge died almost in front of us. The people I don't think they were shucking and jiving us. We did have one informant who was very good, and we would walk with him through the forest looking at these Varolas, and he would say, that one is active, that one isn't, that one is weaker than this one. We collected his statements. Every statement he made about it was correct, but he was the guy who made this stuff that was so horrific. So I think that the knowledge slipped away and was lost.
What year was this?
What year? This would have been 1980.
And in that, when Dennis was taking what did you and Wade do? Were you watching, observing, writing down stuff?
Right. Yeah, we were sitting watching, and Wade had a pretty good medical kit. I mean, we were prepared to do, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation or whatever it took, carry him down to the river and throw him in, whatever it took. After he did it, he said, no more bioassay for me. It's time to bring on the rats for this one. And so, now, so what are the lessons to be learned here? Well, first of all, that the presence of a psychoactive compound in a plant does not certify that it's going to be an effective shamanic tool. I think now that the wonder of Psychotria viridis, the admixture, the common admixture for ayahuasca, is the cleanness of the DMT signature. There is very little else there. And that's what you want. If you analyze a plant and it's just full of stuff, then it's going to pose a problem, because you're going to have too many things happening at once. And it illustrates, the urgency of this kind of work. When you do field work in the Amazon, you will hear rumors, always rumors, of yet stronger hallucinogens. And when you ask people to describe the plant, it, sets your heart pounding, because you can tell it's nothing known to science. My ayahuasquero informant and teacher, Don Fidel Mosambite, he used to say, I use ayahuasca because I want to cure the people. But after getting to know me, he realized that my taste was for the full-blown visions, and he used to say, for this you must learn the magic of the big trees. I would say, what big trees? He'd say, well, not here, not Pucallpa, but in the Rio Vaijaga, the big trees are there. And he would describe these trees, and they were nothing that I could identify to anything in the literature. So it's a kind of a cautionary tale. I don't feel that it was a failure. We had many, many adventures along the way. We discovered the Stropharia cubensis strain at La Chorrera that became known as AMZ, which was a strain that was widely propagated in the States, and so forth. But the mystery of Ukuhe is still unsolved, and I haven't entirely given up. If Colombia would settle down just a little bit more, above La Chorrera, nobody goes, because the Chorro presents such a barrier to moving boats around that they've basically just written it off. Even Schultes took a pass on the upper Igara-Paraná. Nobody's done botany in there since Whiffen was there in 1913. And I think that at a place called Ultimo Retiro, where the most pure and undisturbed Witoto culture, if it exists anywhere, it's there. And it's at the base of a geographical feature called the Cerro Main Hanarai that rises up to about 4,200 feet altitude. And I would bet you that there's plenty of indemnified botany on that mountain. And it would be well worth our trouble, those of us who are enthusiasts of the psychoactive tryptamines, to make one last effort to find out if, in fact, this orally active DMT thing can be confirmed and functions in any way palatable to people of our own sensibilities. If it only gets as good as what we got at Brio Nuevo, then I would put it in the class of an ordeal poison, not a hallucinogen. But it's just one of those mysteries of the Amazon that awaits further investigation, as they say in the literature. Questions?
This story is not the book Wahre Halluzinationen. It's another story in this book.
That's right.
Yes.
Yes.
And will you talk about this too?
The other story?
Yes.
Well, apparently I have no choice, because I didn't fill my time, unless somebody has a bunch of questions about this before we move on. I'm not sure how the last word is pronounced. It's the Cerro Main, M-A-I-N-E, or Maini, Hanarai. And if you look at a relief map of the Amazon, this is quite a striking feature. It's way, way out there. Whiffen is the one to read on this, and he describes above La Chorrera, he says that there are pinnacles of stone sticking out above the jungle, and it's virtually unexplored. I mean, if any place on Earth is unexplored, at least on the ground, this is one of the places. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this area. One approach would be to go not down the Putumayo, but try to approach it via the Caquetá. There is a prison at a place called Tarapacá on the Caquetá, but below this place, but there's no traffic on the on the Rio Caquetá at that point, so you would have to do your own boats. You could get an amphibious airplane to take you in, but once they were gone, you'd be way, way out there in the big green. And we've done triangulation studies. You can tell if you're a geographer and you know the altitude of a mountain, you can draw an elevation of it so that you can picture in your mind what it will look like as you approach it. And as you go down the Caquetá, you would see this thing at quite a distance, and it would rise up to be quite an impressive low mountain off on the left side of the river. And the argument I always make to straight botanists and institutions to try and get them to finance my obsession is that I'm sure there are indemnified plants up there. Altitude, a point of altitude like that in the Amazon is like an island in the sea. And it's exposed rock, so it would be a different soil, a higher altitude, cooler, and I'm sure you would make many botanically interesting discoveries. Whether you would find a Witoto culture intact enough to do much with is a question.
What do you know what kind of soil it is in that area?
Well, around La Chorrera, it's podzols.
In this mountain?
It can't be podzolic, or it wouldn't be there. So probably what the soil at the stones at La Chorrera are a very, very fine-grained basalt. The only time I've ever seen basalt that fine-grained is in the Seychelles Islands. And the Seychelles Islands are part of a geological formation called the Madagascan Mass that includes Komodo, Madagascar, and the Seychelles. And it's claimed that that piece of land has been above water longer than any other place on the planet, that for 300 million years it has not been inundated. It would also be very interesting to understand what happened at La Chorrera to create this chorro and then this lake, because if it were a meteor impact or a volcanic eruption, you would expect the debris to be spread evenly around the whole. It isn't. It's all on one side of the lake. On one side of the lake, there are high basaltic cliffs. On the other side of the lake, it just sort of merges into the flatland of the forest. So it's hard for me, I'm not a geologist, but it's hard for me to imagine anything which would create a deposition of material like that. And these rocks on the high side of the Chorro are the size of semi-trailers. There are thousands of these cubically fragmented rocks. Another argument for orthodox botany is at the Chorro, it moves through there with such speed and energy that it's constantly surrounded by a cloud of spray. And Dennis was at that time didn't have his degree in botany, but he was just transported by the strangeness of the plants within a quarter mile of this waterfall, and you could see it. You didn't have to be a botanist. Something really weird was going on. And these are probably highly indemnified plants that have arisen in this environment of continuous spray and unusual soil right there. So I think it's a very, very fascinating area geologically, botanically, ethnobotanically, culturally. This Witoto language has very little relationship to other languages of the basin.
Any fish live in this place?
Oh yes. No, there were many fish, big fish, paiche, and the usual spectrum of fish, but we were not ichthyologists either. In fact, when we went to La Chorrera the first time, I was a college dropout, and Dennis had a degree in religious studies, and everybody else had majored in cannabis, and that was it. I mean, we were not scientists at that point. Later, Dennis got his degrees in botany and neuroscience and whatever all these things are he is, and I managed to eke out a degree in conservation of natural resources, the most wussed out degree a human being can possibly have. But it's so the mystery of whether, and one reason that I really wanted to understand this was because I've over the years come to the opinion that that no shaman, well, it's not a hard opinion, but I tend to believe that no shaman has ever experienced what happens to you when you smoke chemically pure DMT. It's too hard to concentrate it, that it's much more like what these Waika are experiencing, you know, a clarity of vision, closed-eyed hypnagogia merging into non-dramatic hallucinations. But it's maddening to me. Jonathan touched on this the other day when he said that smoking DMT is twice as powerful as shooting it. Shooting it is twice as powerful as oral activity. Was that what you said? Yeah. And, you know, Rick Strassman did a DMT study over the past couple of years, and as that thing was getting going, I pled with those people. I said, don't inject it. Have people smoke it. You're doing the work for NIDA. They're funding it because they think it's a drug of abuse. Everybody who abuses it, quote unquote, smokes it. So for God's sake, give your subjects it in that form. And they didn't. They injected it. Well, when you inject it, it is a completely different thing. It comes on more slowly, it lasts longer, it's less dramatic, and it's not the same thing. So the mystery of smoking DMT is something almost entirely in the hands of people like ourselves, well-informed members of the underground. But no scientist has ever gazed upon that vista. And, you know, you can write me off as an extravagant character, a screwball, whatever, but I'm telling you, I have a fair sense of the baseline of what goes on this planet, and I tell you, nothing is as peculiar, as challenging to our conceptions of reality as this stuff. I mean, to call it a drug experience is preposterous. It's just masquerades as a drug experience. I don't know what it is. I mean, it is the most philosophically, epistemologically challenging experience you can have this side of the yawning grave. And the fact that, you know, it takes 10 minutes for crying out loud. So, you know, a significant portion of my life's mission is to try, by hyperbole, by outlandish example, by appearing with rave bands, by publishing books, to try and get people to say, hey, this ain't like everything else. You know, in the 10th century, the Islamic historians said of Isfahan, the city in Persia, that it was half the world, they said. DMT is half the world. And scientists, they love to claim that they go where no one's ever gone before, no ethical constraint or constraint of good taste or anything else, or expense. I mean, they've investigated the petroleum atmosphere of Triton. They've hurled probes outside the solar system. It only takes 10 minutes.